All right, this is chapter 4, video 3. Let's launch. Okay, so in this video, we're going to do determining the filing status of the taxpayer. And so with file status, you actually have 5 different types of filing status. The first filing status that you have as an opportunity is going to be married filing joint. And you're also going to have married filing separate, qualifying widower, single, and then head of household. In order to be married filing joint, you have to have been married by the end of the year. So if you get married on January 1st, you get married on December 31st, doesn't matter. As long as you're married by the end of that year, you were considered married for that entire year. And so that's actually kind of important, because sometimes what ends up happening is you'll get some clients who are going to come to you and say, hey, look, we got married in July. Does that mean we have to do separate returns and blah, blah? No, you don't have to do any of that. Actually, it's really stupid easy. As long as you're married by the end of the year, you're considered married for that entire year. The flip is also true, however, and you'll see this in divorce cases where people will come to you and say, look, we've decided that we're going to separate. We're not going to be doing this anymore. And so you say, okay, fine. As long as you were considered not married by the end of the year, you are not considered married for that entire year. So for example, you get a person who decides they want to get divorced, say in March. They go to a judge, and then they go ahead and they ask the judge, they say, look, we want to do a separation agreement. And the judge says, okay, fine, I'm going to do a temporary separation agreement while we proceed with the filings of this. Because the divorce can take a long time, especially if there's numerous assets to be done and there's no prenuptial agreement. Oftentimes what happens is, lawyers are going to argue about stuff. There's going to be negotiations. There's going to be constant going back and forth. And as a result of which, this could drag you out to the point where you're going to really get to, it's going to take you. I've seen where one divorce took almost 2.5 years just because of the fact that everybody was kind of fighting about stuff. So what ends up happening is that sometimes you can go to your client and say, look, if you don't want to do married filing separate returns, as we're going to talk about later on, it's not always a good idea. Go ahead, and especially if there's kids involved, you want to recommend to them that they actually do a separation agreement beforehand. Now, it also depends on your state. So here in the state of Virginia, you can do separation agreements. That's not a problem. But there are some states that it's a little more difficult to do, and so sometimes they won't do it. Sometimes you also have to worry about community property laws, because until there's an actual divorce decree set into place, married filing joint or married filing separate can actually create some interesting dilemmas. Now, if people are actually legitimately married, there's generally no problem. But, where the problem usually comes into effect is when, people are trying to get out of the marriage, and all of a sudden you got to talk to them about community property rules and how that kind of affects things, because that can get really kind of wonky and all that stuff. Another thing to take into consideration is joint several liability for the tax return. In other words, what that means is if both spouses sign that tax return, they're both responsible for both people's income. So if you've got one spouse, I'm going to use this kind of as an example. Say you got one spouse is dealing drugs, and they don't decide to report that income because it's illegal. They don't want to report it, because if they do, they're going to get busted for dealing drugs. So you have one who's dealing drugs and the other one's not. They both sign the tax return, married filing joint. Well, guess what? You're still going to, your other spouse who's totally innocent, who's done nothing on this, maybe doesn't know that they're selling drugs, could end up being in a little bit of problem. Now, some of you might say, okay, well, that's good, Kevin. I'm not going to have those kind of clients. That's going to be the case. But let me tell you something. I actually was dealing with the situation about this, not me personally, but I had a friend of mine who's actually located in Colorado who's a CPA. And one of the biggest problems they had when they legalized marijuana, well, at the federal level, it's still technically an illegal substance. And as a result of that, what ends up happening is that if you're selling marijuana at a marijuana dispensary, legal in the state of Colorado, but from a federal perspective, it's not. You still have to report that income on your tax return. Now, generally speaking, a lot of the marijuana dispensaries, these guys are actually classed up in a lot of this stuff, so they kind of know what they have to do and how the things have to get done. But technically, from a legal standpoint, they're still selling a controlled substance, and that can actually run into some legal issues later on. If they want to make sure, like if they want to make sure that they're reporting stuff correctly, they can go after the spouse and basically say, look, we're going to come after you, blah, 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 so on and so forth. Sometimes, and it was funny, I was asking about it. I said, so you guys just do married filing separate? He said, it's case dependent. Sometimes we do that, sometimes we don't. And, it's always going to be that way. And that's kind of the way it works most of the time in tax anyways, is that it is going to be case dependent. All right. So married filing separately, as we were kind of talking about, there's going to be reasons why you're going to do this. Sometimes you're going to do this because you want to, and sometimes it's because you have to. If you have non-residents who are coming here to the United States, maybe they haven't hit the substantial presence test where they're actually residents of the United States and they can't file a regular tax return, they got to file a 1040 NR. And if they're married, you have to do the married filing separate. You cannot choose to do a married filing joint tax return unless there's a few very special circumstances. One of the most common is if they're tax residents of the Republic of South Korea. What's going to end up happening is they can do married filing joint on the non-resident return, because when they did the tax treaty negotiations, they basically said this is something that we want, and we agreed to it. So if you go to 1040 NR and it says married filing joint, the only people who generally get to be able to do that are South Koreans who are married. But then there's a couple other things. Like I know another thing that's kind of a little strange is that if you're from India, they're allowed to use the standard deduction, which actually that was kind of a big deal. So then we also have the qualifying widower, which is, it's available for the 2 years following the spouse's death. And that's kind of important. So say, for example, somebody, they've been married for many years. One of them dies. And as a result of which, what ends up happening is you now, as the tax preparer, have to do some advice on them. In the year that the person dies, what ends up happening is in the year that the spouse dies, they're still considered married filing joint throughout the entire year. I know I said in the married filing joint portion of this that it's what the status is at the end of the year. This is one of those exceptions. So, a very good thing. I did have a client this last year. Their spouse died in March. We were able to do a married filing joint tax return for them for the rest of this year for 2019, because they died. Actually, they died March of 2020. So we got to do married filing joint because they were married filing by the end of last year. But when we filed their tax returns this year, they're still considered married filing joint, which is going to be very helpful for them because he did have a significant amount of things transfer in towards the end of his death that allowed him to, that's going to allow them to be able to use the married filing joint rates in order to be able to take care of all that. So, but in my client's case, there was no kids involved. Now, if you got a person who has a spouse who dies and there's kids involved, this could be a very good, useful thing to help them with by getting the qualified widower status. Basically, what it does is it makes them married filing joint for another 2 years post the spouse's death, and it's sort of seen as a way for single parents to kind of alleviate some of the tax burdens that's happened, because they've dropped one income, and then at the same time they're going to come back and, oh, by the way, now you got to go from married filing joint to head of household status. It can actually increase their tax rates. And so as a result of that, if one of the spouses dies, surviving spouse, can qualify for it. That. Now, the only exception to this is they say if surviving spouse does not qualify if he or she remarries during the 2 year period. Well, think about that for 5 seconds. Does that really matter? No, it doesn't matter, because think of it this way. If, God forbid, and I'm not obviously wishing this, but say, for example, my wife passes away, but I remarry a year and a half later, well, I'm going to go back to married filing joint status with my new wife. So that's that. I mean, if you think about it, it's not going to be really a painful thing. The thing where I've seen in the past where this actually becomes a bit of a problem is you have it where, spouse dies, 2 very young kids are involved, and the expiration of the 2 years happens. In this case, I did have a client. It was, the husband had died. He died in a bad car accident, which is very unfortunate. And then what ended up happening is that the wife was actually a working professional and went back to work. She had actually taken some time off and went back to work as a result of him passing away. For the first 2 years afterwards, they got married filing joint tax rates. And then, the very year after that, her taxes kind of went up a little bit because she moved from a qualifying widower status to a head of household status. It requires a little bit of planning on your part. So if you're working with a client who's actually dealing with this, you might want to make sure that you're spending a little bit of extra time with them in order to make sure that they have all their stuff taken care of. All right, head of household. So if you are considered unmarried at the end of the year, but you have a dependent, you can actually qualify for this status. The head of household status, essentially, it's basically, you're single and you got a kid, or you're single and you're taking care of a parent who can't take care of themselves anymore. Generally where I've seen this more often than not, obviously, is the single mom, single dad situation. Basically where, they're single, they've got a kid. That's like 99% of the times you're going to see this. Periodically, you're going to have a situation where you've got an unmarried, child. And then, I did have a client like this in the past where, her mom and dad got divorced. Mom couldn't take care of herself because mom had been a house mom the whole time and, didn't have any income or any of that stuff. So she moved in with the daughter so that she could still, and I think last I heard, she was going back to school, trying to get into, some kind of passion of hers. And so, which is a good thing. Daughter helps out, mom in order to be able to do that. And so we actually were looking at doing the head of household status. The problem that we had with her was that she had some investments that were given to her after the divorce, and they were making too much for her to be able to qualify for this. We'll talk about some of those exceptions there, but that's probably the only time that I've seen it where we have like a parent who, is kind of qualifying for this. Now there's going to be a whole host of situations. I mean, very common in Asian cultures is, I remember when my son was born, one of the things that we had kind of talked about was, bringing over someone from the family to come live with us for a few months so that, they could come and, because they were living at home. I think it was her older sister who was retired, say, hey, why doesn't she just come over here, hang out here for a couple years, and then, then she can kind of go back. Unfortunately, she had a health scare that unfortunately prevented her from being able to do that. So all the plans were off with that, but that's a very common thing in Asian cultures. You'll see that quite a bit. I don't have any of my Asian clients that have come to me with this yet so far, but I have had friends of mine, of my wife, because she's Chinese, that have actually asked me about this for these reasons. Married individuals treated as unmarried, for the abandoned spouse. So here's what happens. You have dirtbag husband who decides that he doesn't want to be in a marriage anymore and decides to split town. And the wife comes to you and says, hey, look, my dirtbag husband decided that he doesn't want to be with us anymore. He ran away. And we don't know where he is. Actually, I've heard of a case like this before where the husband basically had run away to Mexico, never seen again. I don't know, maybe he went and ended up in another country afterwards. But, what ended up happening was, with the spouse, the biggest problem they have with the spouse is, how do you do a married filing joint tax return if the other spouse isn't there to do the signature? So you have to do married filing separate for the rest of your life? No, that's not the way this works. She actually ended up getting the marriage terminated through legal circles, which is not, it's time consuming, wasn't difficult, because just get in front of a judge. Hey, he's run away. We don't know where he's at. I think last I heard he was down in Mexico. He's not coming back. I need this marriage terminated so I can go on with my life. And I remember it took a long time for it to get done. At least it felt like it took a long time to get done. But she eventually did, but we were able to get her to do, basically the story goes that they were able to get her to do basically treated as unmarried because of the abandoned spouse. And so that's what ends up happening. In order to qualify for that, you got to live apart from the other spouse, for 6 months out of the year, other than temporary absences. I don't know what temporary absences means when you're abandoned, but I guess you have to look that up, because I've never run into that before. The qualifying person, obviously, if for head of household status, if you got a qualifying child, you're going to qualify. There's pretty much no issues here. If you have a qualifying relative who's a mother's taxpayer or mother or father, the parent doesn't need to live with the taxpayer. And that's actually a big misconception I run into with a lot of clients. They think that, mom and dad have to live with them, and that's not the case. Especially if you have a mom and dad or mother or father who, can't take care of themselves. My father-in-law has actually has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, lives in a retirement home. In that case, if we were providing the support for him, actually he's taking care of by himself, so I'm not worried about it. But if we were providing the support for him, technically we would be able to try to claim him as a dependent if he met the other qualifications. But he doesn't have to live with us in order for that to happen. You do have to qualify as a taxpayer's dependent, which means you got to fall under the qualifying relative rules, which we've talked about in a previous video. Qualifying relative is not the parent, so the person must have lived with the taxpayer for more than half the year, must qualify as a taxpayer's dependent, must be related to the taxpayer through a qualified family relationship. And this is actually interesting. I'll share a little story about me. When I was younger and I was living in Texas, I got sick and tired of working the fast food thing, and I'd actually done bartending school, and I went to go become a bartender. And but the only bartending job that I could find, because it was a pretty small town, was a part-time job at the local country club. And I was working, part-time here, and then I was doing like the catering services whenever they had a need for me. So sometimes I went to full-time. Most of the time I was at part-time. Well, I couldn't live on my own, and I didn't have a place to live. And so a buddy of mine was like, let me talk to my mom, see if we can get you to live here. And I ended up doing that. And so for about 6 months, I lived in their house. She cut me a deal, said, look, pay me $100 a month or whatever. Well, I don't remember. It was some ridiculously low number. But it ended up being about 20% of my salary, whatever it was. Like I said, I was part-time. Most of the time I wasn't making much. And, technically, other than the related portion, I would have been her dependent because I wasn't making enough money. I don't know what the numbers were back then, but technically she was providing more than half of my support because I couldn't afford to live in a house by myself. So this could have been an interesting situation had we been related. She was a wonderful lady. I've actually lost touch with the family, unfortunately, which kind of stinks, but okay, folks. Well, that's all I got to say about that. I'm glad to see you guys, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next video.